All right, hey YouTube, I have got an absolutely giga-brain video for you today. So thanks for making it onto my channel. If you have any questions or comments, pop them down below. And if you'd like to work with me on your own strength and physique goals, there's a link in the description. Today, we're going to talk about not dropping the bar on deadlifts. And I want to just introduce this topic with where I first started to see this trend occurring. So basically, I was in a powerlifting meet back about 10 years ago. And there was a lad there, he was deadlifting, and he deadlifted 4 plates aside in a powerlifting meet. Lifted it, got to the top, dropped the bar down, and then stood up and screamed at the top of his lungs, "Lightweight, baby." And we all stood there like, yes, it is a lightweight. Why are you screaming? Just didn't make any sense. So I started to notice people doing that a lot. Now, that then sort of seeped its way into the gym and bodybuilding circles, and I started to see people dropping the bar on deadlifts. I was like, what's going on? What is this? I never dropped the bar on deadlifts, and I was a powerlifter. So what we're talking about is either taking the bar up to the top and just like dropping it down. You know, people do that with this sort of arrogant like shrug, and, or letting it free fall to the ground with your hands still attached to it. I can only trace this back to the 2000s, but there's some of the guys who watch my videos, they're a bit older, so they might know it's from the 80s and 90s as well. I don't know. All I know, it feels like a relatively recent trend. Anyway, that's kind of what we're talking about. So what I want to talk about is I want to talk about the eccentric for hypertrophy, for growing muscle, for getting gains. Now, the research shows us that we have roughly 20 to 40% more strength in the eccentric stroke of the rep. Okay, stroke. When you're finished on the concentric stroke, which is the upward stroke, you still have more left on the negative. So it's likely that the greater strength potential of the eccentric leads to marginally greater gains, because basically you have more loading. And as we know, mechanical tension is one of the prime drivers for growth. So if we are literally loading the muscle with more stress, then we are going to grow more. So if we can utilize the eccentric, and we should be able to get more volume in the eccentric, that means we are going to get more growth. This we see in the research. We see if we truly emphasize the eccentric, we get more gains. Right now, the hypothesis is that it's possibly coming from the fact that we just have more to give in the eccentric. So when we're done on the concentric, we're not done on the eccentric. So if we're ignoring the eccentric, we're leaving gains on the table, basically every single rep. So the idea is that if we take both eccentric, like negative, and concentric, the positive, to failure or close to that, then by virtue of doing both to failure or close to, we accumulate greater mechanical loading via the eccentric. Thereby, we have greater hypertrophy potential, because basically we're doing more work and more useful work. Not emphasizing the negative is basically like keeping a bunch of reps away from failure. If you think about it, if you just compartmentalize your thinking and say, okay, I've got, say, a set of 10. Let's split it in half. We've got half of it is eccentric, half of it is concentric, right? So if we completely ignore the eccentric completely, it's kind of like just doing 5 reps. Not quite, but you get the idea. In terms of what we're leaving on the table, we're leaving half of it on the table, quite literally. And it's the half which gives us more growth. Generally, does more damage, causes more growth, we can lift more weight. I don't know whether there's any actual mechanism by which it gives us more damage, apart from just the fact we can load the muscle more. So the general rule of thumb is 1 second for the positive, maybe 3 seconds for the negative. You're basically just, you have more tension on the muscle. So if you're just ignoring all that, it's basically like skipping your reps, essentially. You can think of it in that way. Now, the question is, well, why don't powerlifters emphasize negatives? The first answer is because they're simple. Second answer is actually we do. I did. I always did. I was always taught to. Now, there are powerlifting coaches who will disagree with me, and I get that. There is a possible reason, so I will discuss that reason. Strength is very specific, okay? So pooling all of your training adaptations and all of your training emphasis towards the lifting portion makes actually some sense for a powerlifter, because you can always lower what you can lift. So it does make some sense to, if you're really, really solely focused on powerlifting, perhaps you're peaking for a meet, then direct all of your training adaptations towards just the lifting and ignore the lowering. Personally, I always lowered under control. To quote Leroy Davis, Dorian Yates' training partner, for the mass, right? So yes, you're a powerlifter, but no one likes a skinny powerlifter. So the goal is still to gain some mass, right? So I don't think it's a wise idea just not to emphasize the negative if you're a powerlifter, and if you're a bodybuilder, it makes completely no sense. So yeah, to answer that question, actually, a lot of us do. Like, we do emphasize the negative. I think it's not a wise idea to avoid the negative if you're an off-season powerlifter. There's potentially an argument to be made if you are an in-season powerlifter, but it's not an argument that I would take. I would just say train the negatives all the way up to the meet, and then at the meet maybe lower the bar faster, maybe. Anyway, that's kind of not really the point of today. The point is more about lowering the weight, lowering the deadlift for mass. So this next bit, this kind of blew my mind, because I saw this in a research study, and this was like eccentric and concentric adaptations are actually different. This kind of was like, whoa, this is they both contribute to hypertrophy, but they do it via different pathways. That's like insane. So it's not a situation that if you don't emphasize the negative, you just get less gains. You actually get nothing via that pathway. That's like, whoa, it's a real mind F, that is. So it's a really bad thing if you're not emphasizing the negative. Or I guess what most people would do would be to do more volume. So this is probably why people get a lot of junk volume in, because they're using really light weights. They're just shoving the weight up, letting it drop back down. And you can do a lot of volume that way. But the problem is that leads to greater systemic fatigue, greater wear and tear on the joint. It's probably one of the reasons why high volume routines really wreck your joints, because you are just not getting a very good stimulus to fatigue ratio, because you're ignoring the eccentric. A lot of these guys do. You see them pumping away in the gym. They don't have any control on the way down, and they're just pumping out reps. That reduces overall loading unless you just ramp up the volume. And that's, I guess, what people do. And that's part of what is junk reps. That's a really big deal. So just want to emphasize that last point one more time. It's highly probable that if you're not emphasizing the negative, it'll either lead to less overall growth, which is a bad thing, for the same time in the gym, or it will lead you to compensate by doing more volume, which will increase your systemic fatigue per stimulus. Hypothetically, you can get more growth stimulus with less sets and reps and less systemic fatigue if you emphasize the negative. That is huge. That is huge. That's a big deal. Everyone should be doing that. Does this apply to the rest of the body? Hence is the natural question. My entire video has been about lifting deadlifts and lowering them slowly, but that was really just an introduction to what is a greater topic, and that is actually emphasizing the eccentric phase for the rest of the body as well. I don't believe in just scrappy reps. You should emphasize the negative, and I've laid out all the reasons why you should. So yeah, it applies to the whole body. So in summary, you may well be greatly, and I feel confident in saying greatly because of the argument I've laid out in multiple ways. You may be greatly hampering your gains by not emphasizing the negative, by either reducing the stimulus, which is definite, reducing the stimulus per set and reps that you do, or by increasing systemic fatigue because you would compensate by just doing more volume. It's just a waste. If you're doing sloppy reps where you're just lifting and you're dropping the weight and you're not emphasizing the eccentric, you could probably get more gains by just switching to a low volume approach and emphasizing the negative. I think it's probably one of the reasons why people get a lot of gains using a low volume approach, because when they only have, say, 8 to 10 sets per muscle group to do per week, they're able to focus a lot more and really put their all into those sets. And you typically see a lot of these low volume advocates do that. Sometimes their form is pretty good. And so it's probably because they really get the most out of every rep. Full range of motion, full concentric, eccentric on the way down, nice and slow. So the idea, if you want to practice this, is to emphasize the negative. Explode under control on the way up, lower slowly. The common guideline is anywhere up to about a second or so for the positive, the concentric, and anything up to about 2 or 3 seconds for the negative. Now, going too far down that rabbit hole and going really, really slow on the eccentric actually leads to less systemic, less local muscular stimulus. So that's not wise. That was a trend a few years ago. People would do a training approach called super slow. It was like a HIIT advocate thing, but that's provably wrong. So we don't do that. But slowing it down to the point where you're maybe taking 2 or 3 seconds to lift the eccentric is definitely a good idea. That's what I would highly recommend. And I've laid out an argument for why. So don't skimp on that. You could be losing out on gains, increasing systemic fatigue unnecessarily. You could be putting more wear and tear on your joints. You could be doing any number of things which are going to hamper your progress in the short and long term. Don't miss out on what is half or potentially more than half of your gains by just dropping the bar to the floor, to your chest, whatever. Right. It's a nice practical takeaway for you guys there. All right. If you haven't done so already, then you have made it to the end of this video. Go ahead and subscribe. Leave a comment. It helps the algorithm, apparently, I've been told. And I have opened up the subscribe option, but only for those people who emphasize the eccentric. Thank you.